There was a smell that lived in certain kitchens and never anywhere else. Bacon grease saved in a coffee can by the stove, a pot that never fully emptied, a woman who could feed 6 people on what most of us throw in the trash without thinking twice. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. None of that was poverty. It was mastery. 100 meals, 100 women and men who turned nothing into supper, decade after decade, region after region, and did it so well that 70 years later, restaurants are charging you $20 a plate for what your grandmother made for free. We didn't lose these recipes. They were taken from us, one convenience aisle at a time. Let's start at the bottom of the pot and work our way up to the truth, number 100. Creamed chipped beef on toast soldiers called it something else entirely, something you won't hear on this channel, but their mothers back home called it supper. Dried beef, sliced paper-thin, soaked to pull the salt back out, then folded into a white gravy thickened with nothing but flour and bacon fat. Poured hot over toast until the bread went soft in the middle and stayed crisp at the edge. 19 cents bought a jar of dried beef in 1943, and that jar fed a family of 5 for 2 nights running. This was not garnish. This was the whole meal, and it tasted like it mattered. Number 99. Fried mush cornmeal boiled soft in water the night before, poured into a loaf pan, and left to set overnight in the icebox. By morning it had gone firm enough to slice. Grandma cut it in inch-thick slabs and fried it in bacon grease until the outside turned the color of a chestnut, and the inside stayed warm and soft as pudding. Cornmeal cost 3 cents a pound in Pennsylvania Dutch country through the 1930s, and 1 pot of mush stretched across 2 full meals, soft the first night, fried and golden the next morning. Nothing about that was an accident. That was arithmetic done with a wooden spoon. Number 98. Souse the hog's head went into the pot when the rest of the animal was already smoked, salted, and hanging. German-American farm families across the Midwest boiled it for hours until the meat gave up and fell from the bone, then packed it into a loaf pan with vinegar and spice and let it set into something between a jelly and a terrine. In the 1920s and 30s it cost almost nothing, because the head was the part the butcher couldn't sell. Today, a restaurant plates the same thing, calls it tearing, and charges $22 for a slice the size of a deck of cards. That is not progress. That is amnesia with a price tag. Number 97. Liver and onions liver sold for $0.10 a pound because nobody wanted it, and that made it the meat a poor family could actually afford. Sliced thin, dredged in flour, fried hard in the same skillet where the onions had already gone soft and sweet. The onions did the work the liver couldn't do alone. They covered the iron-heavy taste with something a child would eat without complaint. Farm households across the rural Midwest served it once a week, not because they loved it, but because it was the only protein within reach. They knew things about stretching a dime that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 96. Pinto beans no meat. No bacon fat, some weeks when even that ran out. Just dried pintos soaked overnight, simmered low for hours until the water turned thick and the beans went soft enough to mash against the roof of your mouth. 5 cents a pound across the rural Southwest and the Great Plains, and a single pound of pintos, cooked slow, fed a family of 5 for 2 full days. This was the backbone starch of the entire decade, the meal underneath every other meal on this list. Grandma just called it beans. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 95. Ketchup soup in the tenements of Depression-era Chicago. Hot water. A spoonful of ketchup, and whatever crackers were left in the tin passed for a bowl of tomato soup. It cost almost nothing because ketchup was already in the cupboard, already paid for, already stretched as far as it could go. This is not a heartwarming story. This is the floor. This is what it looked like when a family had run out of almost everything else, and a mother still found a way to put a hot bowl in front of a child and call it dinner. Number 94. Mustard sandwich 2 slices of bread, a smear of yellow mustard between them, nothing else. Families who followed the road out of Oklahoma in 1936, chasing whatever work existed past the dust, carried mustard jars because mustard didn't spoil in a hot car and it made bread taste like something instead of nothing. There was no meat to put beside it. There was no butter to soften it. There was a jar, and there was bread, and there was a mother deciding that her children would eat something that tasted like a choice, even when it wasn't one. Number 93. Poke salad. The plant grew wild along fence lines and ditch banks all through Appalachia, and every part of it above the root is poisonous unless you know exactly what you're doing. Grandma knew. She picked the young spring leaves before they turned dark, boiled them in 3 separate changes of water to pull the toxins out, then finished them in bacon grease like any other mess of greens. This was not a recipe you found in a book. This was knowledge passed hand to hand, mother to daughter, because getting it wrong could kill you and getting it right meant free food growing along every road in Tennessee and Kentucky. Number 92. Dandelion greens with bacon grease. Every lawn in the Ohio Valley grew this vegetable for free, and most people spent the 1930s pulling it up and throwing it away. Grandma picked it before it flowered, when the leaves were still tender, and wilted it fast in a hot skillet with bacon fat and a splash of vinegar. Today you'll find it on a menu called a wild green salad, $14 a plate, dressed in balsamic instead of bacon grease. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The weed in your yard right now is the same vegetable they're charging you to eat. Number 90. Hoe cake cornmeal, water, salt, nothing more, mixed into a thin batter and cooked flat on whatever surface was hot. A griddle if you had one, the flat blade of a garden hoe over an open fire if you didn't, which is exactly where the name came from. Georgia and Carolina low-country families made these when there was no egg, no milk, no leavening of any kind in the house. Crisp at the edges, soft in the center, gone in 4 bites. This is the ancestor of the cornbread flight. Some restaurant is selling you now as an appetizer. It started as a woman with no ingredients and a hot piece of iron, refusing to let her family go hungry. Number 89. Johnny Cake New England fishing families ground their own white flint corn, the same variety Rhode Island farmers had grown since before the country existed, into a fine meal that cooked up smoother than southern cornbread. Mixed with hot water into a paste, dropped by the spoonful onto a griddle, fried until the edges went lace-thin and brown. A fisherman could eat 3 of these standing up before dawn and be out on the water by the time the sun cleared the horizon. This was not breakfast as we understand it now. This was fuel, built by hand, from corn a family grew and ground themselves. Number 88. Chow chow at the end of the growing season, whatever was left in the garden. Green tomatoes still hard on the vine, the last cabbage, peppers that would never fully ripen before frost, went into the same crock. Chopped fine, packed in vinegar and sugar and mustard seed, sealed and left to work through the winter. Appalachian families spooned it over beans, over cornbread, over anything that needed a little brightness in January. Nothing in that garden went to waste, and nothing in that jar was ever thrown away either. That is not a condiment. That is a family's insurance policy against an empty February. Number 87. Pickled pig's feet when a hog was butchered. Every part of it had a destination, and the feet went into a crock of vinegar brine with peppercorns and bay leaf to cure for weeks. Southern black families across the rural South turned what other households discarded into a food that kept without refrigeration and stretched a single animal's usefulness for months past the actual butchering day. There was no waste in that kitchen. There was no part of that animal that wasn't somebody's dinner eventually. That is not a delicacy now, dressed up on some bar menu. That is what it always was. Respect for an animal that gave everything. Number 85. Liver Mush Western North Carolina took the cheapest parts of the hog, liver, head meat, trimmings nobody else wanted, ground them together with cornmeal and spice, and pressed the mixture into a loaf that would slice and fry like Scrapple's southern cousin. It cost pennies because it was made from what the butcher couldn't move. Grocery stores in that part of the state still stock it today, not as nostalgia, but because families never stopped eating it. This was not a Depression fad that faded when the decade ended. This was a food so good it outlived the poverty that invented it. Number 84. Scrapple, Pennsylvania Dutch farmers wasted nothing when a hog went to slaughter, and Scrapple was the proof. Every scrap of meat too small or too odd to sell on its own, the trim, the organ pieces, the parts that had no other name, simmered for hours with cornmeal until it formed a thick mush, then poured into a loaf pan to set overnight. Sliced and fried the next morning, it turned crisp outside and soft within, and it fed a family breakfast for a week off a single afternoon's butchering. That is not scraps. That is a woman looking at a pile of nothing and building a week of breakfasts out of it. Number 83. Poor man's steak ground beef alone couldn't stretch to feed a family through the Depression, so it never went in the pan alone. Crushed saltine crackers, an egg if there was one, onion, milk if it could be spared, all worked into the meat until a single pound of ground beef became a loaf that fed 6 instead of 2. Sliced and pan-fried until the edges crisped like an actual steak, it earned its name honestly. It was the closest thing to steak a family would see all month. This was not fraud. This was a woman doing math with a mixing bowl until the numbers came out even. Number 82. Mock chicken legs cubes of cheap pork shoulder, threaded onto a wooden skewer to mimic the shape of a drumstick, breaded and fried until the outside went golden. Working families in industrial Detroit and across the Midwest couldn't afford actual chicken with any regularity, so they built the shape of it out of the pork they could afford. And children grew up believing, at least at the dinner table, that they were eating something better than they were. That is not a lie. That is a mother protecting her children from knowing exactly how little there was. Number 81. Depression cake, no eggs. No milk, no butter, none of the 3 ingredients that defined a normal cake, because none of the 3 were reliably in the house. Flour, sugar, cocoa, baking soda, vinegar, oil, and water mixed directly in the baking pan to save on dirty dishes. Here's the real science behind it. The vinegar and baking soda react on contact, releasing carbon dioxide that lifts the batter the same way eggs would in a normal recipe. Nationwide, women who had never studied chemistry in their lives were using it correctly every week, out of pure necessity, decades before anyone wrote the reaction down in a textbook. Number 80. War cake by 1942, rationing had done to every kitchen in America what the Depression had already done to poor ones. Butter was gone to the war effort. Eggs were scarce. War cake solved it the same way Depression cake had a decade earlier. Oil in place of butter, applesauce, or mashed raisins in place of eggs, spice enough to make the substitution taste intentional. A nation of women who had already survived 1 decade of scarcity turned out to be exactly the generation equipped to survive the next one. They knew things about rationing that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 79. Milk toast bread, toasted until it held its shape, laid in a bowl, and covered in warm milk with a little sugar and butter if there was butter to spare. Doctors of the era prescribed it for the sick because it was gentle and easy to keep down. Poor families served it for an entirely different reason, because on the leanest nights, bread and milk was simply all there was. The same dish that comforted a fevered child also fed a family that had run out of everything else, and nobody in that kitchen ever confused the 2 reasons out loud. Number 78. Beanie weenies by the 1940s and into the 50s, canned beans and sliced hot dogs heated together in one pot had become the fastest hot meal a working family could put on the table after a full shift. It came directly out of the scarcity that preceded it, the same beans and meat logic that had fed Depression-era families for a decade, now sold in a can for the sake of speed instead of survival. The ingredients hadn't changed. Only the excuse had. Number 77. Government cheese casserole starting in the 1960s, USDA commodity programs distributed blocks of processed cheese to low-income families across the country. Real cheese, real government trucks, real distribution centers where people lined up with the same quiet dignity their grandparents had shown in a soup line 30 years earlier. Families melted it over noodles, over vegetables, over whatever else was in the pantry, and stretched a single block across a week of dinners. This was not a handout people were ashamed of. This was a government finally admitting what families had known since the Depression, that a nation this wealthy has no excuse for a hungry child. Number 76. Powdered egg omelet fresh eggs vanished from ration-era kitchens by 1943, replaced by a tin of yellow powder that had to be reconstituted with water before it would even resemble food. Whisked hard enough, seasoned aggressively enough, fried fast in a hot pan, it became something close enough to an omelet that a hungry family didn't argue with it. The real science here is dehydration itself. Egg solids, stripped of moisture, could sit on a shelf for a year without spoiling, which is exactly why the government chose them for rationing in the first place. A woman turned a chemistry problem into breakfast, and nobody thanked her for it. Number 75. Hoover stew hot dogs sliced thin, elbow macaroni, canned tomatoes, canned corn, all of it simmered together in one pot until it thickened into something that could feed a shantytown family for 2 nights. It got its name in the Hoovervilles themselves. Bitterly, after the president families blamed for the collapse that put them there in the first place. This was not comfort food. This was a pot named after your own resentment, cooked over a fire in a camp built from scrap lumber because there was nowhere else left to live and nothing else left to eat. Number 74. Beans and cornbread put together, they made something the body couldn't get from either one alone. The amino acids missing from the beans were sitting right there in the corn, and the body absorbed the combination as something close to complete protein. Nobody in Appalachia or the Deep South needed a nutritionist to explain that in the 1930s. They just knew it filled you differently than beans alone ever did. That is not folk wisdom mistaken for science. That is science discovered generations before anyone in a laboratory got around to writing it down. Number 73. Squirrel gravy over biscuits a boy with a .22 rifle could bring home dinner in an Appalachian afternoon, and his mother turned it into gravy. The meat browned, pulled from the bone, folded into a roux thickened with flour, and the last of the milk, ladled hot over biscuits, made that same morning. Nothing about the animal went unused, and nothing about the meal apologized for what it was. A family ate well off what the woods gave for free and called it exactly what it was. Supper. Number 72. Chitterlings the small intestines of the hog, cleaned for hours, a task nobody who hasn't done it can understand the labor of, then boiled low and slow until they turned tender, seasoned hard with vinegar and pepper to cut through the richness. Southern black families through the 1920s and 30s built entire holiday traditions around a cut of the animal that white households threw directly into the offal pile. This was not desperation dressed up as tradition. This was generations of cooks proving that skill, not money, decided whether a meal was worth remembering. Number 71. Red-eye gravy ham drippings left in the skillet, black coffee poured straight in while it was still hot, scraped and stirred until it thinned into a gravy the color of rust. Appalachian and Southern farm families ladled it over biscuits at breakfast before a full day of field work, and nothing about it wasted a single drop of what the ham had already given. The coffee wasn't a garnish. It was the only liquid within reach that morning, and a cook found a way to make it into something a family looked forward to. Number 70. Sawmill gravy and biscuits logging camps across the Pacific Northwest and the South ran on this. Flour browned in bacon fat. Milk stirred in until it thickened. Black pepper enough to wake a man up before a 12-hour shift with a crosscut saw. A camp cook could feed a whole crew of loggers off flour, fat, and milk for pennies a man and send them out into the timber with something warm sitting in their stomachs. That is not a small thing. That is the difference between a man who makes it through the shift and one who doesn't. Number 69. Vinegar pie on the Great Plains during the Dust Bowl years. Fruit simply wasn't there. The orchards had dried up along with everything else. So a cook built a pie filling out of vinegar, sugar, butter, and egg, cooked until it thickened into something with the same tang and sweetness fruit would have given, poured into a crust, and baked until set. Nobody was fooled into thinking it was apple. They were grateful it tasted like dessert at all, in a decade when dessert had become a word people almost forgot how to use. Number 68. Water pie water, flour, sugar, butter, vanilla if it could be spared, no fruit, no filling beyond what those 5 ingredients could accomplish together in an oven. Rural Texas and Oklahoma families made it when even the vinegar for vinegar pie wasn't in the house. It set into something custard-like, sweet enough to pass as a treat, and it proved something no cookbook has ever managed to teach as well, that a woman with almost nothing could still decide her family deserved dessert. Number 67. Mock apple pie in 1934. Nabisco printed a recipe on the back of a Ritz cracker box that turned crushed crackers, sugar, cinnamon, and lemon juice into something that tasted astonishingly like apple pie. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. That recipe wasn't charity. It was a company recognizing that Depression-era families couldn't afford apples and building a product specifically to profit from that scarcity. The pie itself was genuinely clever. The company profiting from a nation's hunger was not. Number 66. Green tomato pie every autumn. Frost came for the garden before the last tomatoes had a chance to ripen, and rural households across the Midwest and South refused to let that fruit go to waste. Sliced thin, sugared, spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, baked into a crust the same way a ripe tomato never could have been. It tasted tart where an apple pie tastes sweet, and families came to prefer it that way. Frost took the season. It never took the pie. Number 65. Cracklin' bread when a hog was rendered down for lard. The crisp bits of skin and fat left behind in the pot. The cracklings went straight into that night's cornbread batter instead of the trash. Deep South households folded them in whole, and the bread came out of the oven studded with pockets of crunch and pork flavor no plain cornbread could match. This was rendering day's final gift, a family's supper built from what most kitchens today would scrape into the garbage without a second thought. Number 64. Hominy grits with fatback corn treated with lime or wood ash until the hull loosened and the kernel opened up. A process called nixtamalization, discovered independently across cultures on both sides of the ocean, is what turned field corn into something a body could actually digest and absorb nutrients from. Southern sharecropper households boiled the treated corn into grits and served it with a sliver of fatback for what fat and protein the family could spare. That process wasn't folklore. It was food chemistry, practiced daily by women who never once called it that. Number 63. Cush cornbread, crumbled and toasted in a skillet, with a little fat and sugar until it turned into a warm, sweet mush spooned hot into a bowl. The dish traces back further than the Depression itself. carried forward through generations of Southern black foodways that predate the 1930s by decades. A piece of culinary memory that survived slavery, survived Reconstruction, and was still on the table when the whole country went hungry together. This was not invented out of Depression scarcity. It was inherited, protected, and kept alive by people who understood exactly what it meant to lose everything and still hold on to how you eat. Number 62. Salt pork and beans pork packed in salt could sit in a barrel through a whole winter without refrigeration, and New England and Appalachian families relied on it exactly for that reason. A chunk simmered low with dried beans for hours, until the salt worked its way into the broth, and the beans turned rich enough to eat as a full meal on their own. No icebox, no electricity required, just salt, thyme, and a family that understood preservation as survival, long before anyone called it food science. Number 61. Chuck wagon beans cattle drives across Texas and the Great Plains ran on a chuck wagon cook's ability to feed a dozen hungry men off almost nothing, and beans, simmered all day over a low fire with whatever salt pork was on hand, were the backbone of it. Onion, if there was one. Chili peppers if the trail passed near a trading post. No refrigeration for 100 miles in any direction, and none needed. Dried beans traveled better than almost anything else a wagon could carry. Cowboys ate this pot after a full day in the saddle, and rodeo cook-offs still serve a version of it today because some recipes simply refuse to disappear. Number 60. Son of a gun stew when cattle were branded and worked on the open range. The organ meats, heart, liver, sweetbreads, marrow, didn't keep long enough to haul back to the ranch house, so the cook threw them all into one pot on the spot and made supper out of what would otherwise have been left in the dirt. Texas cattle ranches built an entire mythology of toughness around this stew. The idea that a man proved something by eating what squeamish city folk wouldn't touch. Underneath the mythology was a simpler truth. Nothing from that animal was going to waste. Not on a working ranch, not in a decade when waste wasn't a luxury anyone could afford. Number 59. Trail biscuits a Dutch oven. Buried in hot coals, turned flour, lard, and a little buttermilk into biscuits that could survive a cattle drive without spoiling for days. Western trail cooks baked them fresh most mornings when they could, and relied on the ones from yesterday when they couldn't. No icebox on a cattle drive, no bakery within 100 miles, just a cast-iron pot, a bed of coals, and a cook who understood exactly how long that dough needed before it was ready to feed a dozen men before dawn. Number 58. Beef jerky Great Plains ranch families sliced tough cuts thin against the grain, salted them heavily, and hung them to dry in the wind and sun until the moisture was gone, and the meat had turned into something that would keep for months without spoiling. This wasn't a snack food. It was preservation science, practiced by hand, salt drawing moisture out of the meat fast enough that bacteria never got the chance to take hold. A rancher could carry a week of protein in a saddlebag and never once worry about it going bad. Number 57. Campfire cornbread Western ranch hands mixed cornmeal batter right in camp and baked it in a cast-iron skillet set directly in the coals, the crust blackening at the edges while the center stayed soft and warm. No oven required, no kitchen required, just fire, iron, and a hand steady enough to know when it was done by smell alone. That same cast-iron technique is trendy again now, sold in cookbooks as rustic and elevated. It was never elevated. It was simply how you cooked when you had nothing but a fire and a skillet, and it worked. Number 56. Rattlesnake meat protein was protein on the West Texas and New Mexico range, and a rancher who killed a rattler in the course of a day's work wasn't going to leave it in the dirt when it could be skinned, cleaned, and fried up like any other meat. Most families back east would have refused it outright. Out on the range, refusing free protein wasn't a decision anyone could afford to make. That is not a stunt. That is a family deciding that squeamishness was a luxury they'd left behind the day they moved west. Number 55. Prairie oysters at branding time, when young bulls were castrated on the spot, the trimmings didn't go in the dirt. They went straight into a hot skillet, breaded and fried until crisp on the outside. Cattle camps across the Great Plains treated it as simply another cut of the animal, no different from any other organ meat that needed using before it spoiled. This was the same principle that ran through every single item on this list so far, applied without hesitation, without apology, without a single part of the animal treated as beneath eating. Number 54. Chicken fried steak, the toughest, cheapest cuts of beef. Round steak, mostly, the part with the least marbling and the most connective tissue, got pounded flat with a mallet until the fibers broke down, dredged in seasoned flour, and fried hard in a skillet the same way you'd fry chicken. Texas and Oklahoma families turned a cut nobody wanted into something crisp and tender enough to fool you into thinking it was expensive. Today it sells for $24 on a trendy restaurant menu, plated with a sprig of parsley, as though the dish needed elevating. It didn't. It was already perfect. It just needed someone hungry enough to be clever about it. Number 53. Bacon grease gravy. Every kitchen in the rural South and across the plains kept a can by the stove for exactly this purpose. The fat left behind after frying bacon, saved rather than poured down the drain, reheated and thickened with flour into a gravy that cost nothing beyond what had already been spent. This is not a recipe you'll find in a cookbook, because it was never written down. It didn't need to be. Every woman in that kitchen already knew it, the same way she knew not to waste a single thing that came off that stove. Number 52. Sourdough biscuits, Western homesteads, and ranches kept a starter alive for years, sometimes decades, a living culture of wild yeast fed daily with flour and water, needing no store-bought leavening to make a biscuit rise. A rancher's wife could bake bread and biscuits indefinitely off that one starter, passed down sometimes across generations, never once needing to buy a packet of yeast from a store that might be 100 miles away. That starter was not a hobby. It was infrastructure, kept alive the same way you'd keep a fire burning. Number 51. Pasta e fagioli Italian immigrants crowded into tenements in New York, and Boston brought this dish with them from villages where meat was a luxury and beans, and pasta were what fed a family through the winter. Dried beans, whatever pasta scraps were left in the cupboard, a little garlic, a little tomato if it could be afforded, simmered together into something thick enough to eat with a fork. Today, an American restaurant serves it as pasta fagioli, $18 a bowl, garnished and photographed. The immigrants who built this dish weren't chasing a trend. They were making sure nobody in the family went to bed hungry. Number 50. Polenta Northern Italian immigrant farming families across California and Pennsylvania grew up on cornmeal boiled slow in water until it turned thick and smooth, poured out onto a wooden board, and served instead of bread because bread cost more than the corn did. It could be eaten soft and hot the first night, then sliced and fried the next morning, the same way fried mush was back at item 99, because poor kitchens on opposite sides of an ocean arrived at the same solution independently, out of the same necessity. Today it's $15 a plate, called creamy polenta, plated with a drizzle of oil. It was never missing anything. It was always finished. Number 49. Papa al pomodoro stale bread, too hard to eat on its own, torn into pieces and simmered into a pot of tomatoes, garlic, and olive oil until it broke down and thickened the whole soup. Italian immigrant households refused to throw away a loaf just because it had gone stale. Stale bread was still bread, still calories, still worth saving. This dish exists entirely because someone looked at bread that most kitchens today would toss in the trash and asked a different question. What can this still become? Number 48. Coal cannon Irish immigrants carried the memory of famine with them across the ocean, and coal cannon, mashed potatoes folded together with cabbage or kale, a little butter or bacon fat worked in if it could be spared, was survival food long before it reached tenements in Boston and New York. Two of the cheapest, most available vegetables in any Irish American kitchen combined into something that filled a stomach and stretched across a whole family's dinner. This dish carried grief inside it that most people eating it today never learn about. Number 47. Irish stew, the cheapest cuts of mutton, tough and full of connective tissue, simmered for hours with potatoes, onions, and whatever root vegetables were in season until the meat finally surrendered and the broth thickened on its own. Irish immigrant neighborhoods built entire Sunday traditions around a pot that had started generations earlier as a way to make an unaffordable animal stretch across an entire week. Time did what money couldn't. It always has. Number 46. Boxty half the potatoes grated raw, half mashed and cooked, mixed together with flour into a batter, and fried into pancakes on a hot griddle. Irish immigrant communities built this dish specifically to use every potato in the house, no matter its condition, the ones too small to peel easily, the ones already half mashed for another meal, all of it folded into one pan. Waste was never a choice available to these families. It simply wasn't in the vocabulary. Number 45. Spätzle, with large German immigrant farm towns across the Midwest, made these small, irregular egg noodles by scraping batter directly off a board into boiling water, and finished them not in butter, which cost more, but in rendered lard, which was already sitting in a jar from the last hog butchering. Cheaper than store-bought pasta, made entirely from what the farm already produced. A family fed itself off its own land and its own labor, without a single ingredient that had to be purchased. Number 44. Sauerkraut and pork scraps cabbage, packed tight in salt, and left to ferment for weeks, turned into something that would keep through an entire winter without spoiling. Real preservation science, the same lactic acid fermentation that pickles a cucumber, working slowly in a crock in a German-American cellar. Simmered with whatever pork trimmings were left after butchering, it became a dish that tasted better the longer it sat, built entirely around a preservation method that predates refrigeration by centuries. Number 43. Matzo brie during Passover, when leavened bread wasn't allowed in the house. Broken pieces of matzo. Never the whole sheets. Always the scraps that had cracked in the box, got soaked in water or egg and fried in a hot pan until crisp at the edges. Jewish immigrant tenements on the Lower East Side built an entire dish specifically around using the pieces other households would have discarded. Even during a holiday defined by restriction, nothing in that kitchen went to waste. Number 42. Kasha Varnishke's buckwheat groats, cheaper and heartier than rice, tossed with bow-tie pasta and caramelized onions until the whole dish turned rich and nutty. Jewish immigrant households in New York built meals around buckwheat specifically because it cost less than the alternatives and filled a stomach just as completely. This was not a compromise dish, eaten while wishing for something better. Families requested it. They loved it. They still make it today, generations past the poverty that first put it on the table. Number 41. Schmaltz on bread rendered chicken fat, strained and saved in a jar the same way bacon grease was saved in southern kitchens, spread thick on a slice of bread with a little salt. Jewish immigrant tenements rendered every bit of fat off every chicken they cooked, because throwing it away meant throwing away flavor and calories a family couldn't spare. This is the same instinct that runs through nearly every single item on this list. Dressed in a different language, cooked in a different kitchen, arrived at by a different immigrant family an ocean away from the last one. And it is always, always the same instinct. Nothing gets wasted. Nothing gets thrown away. Everything gets used. Number 40. Beans and tortillas Mexican and Mexican-American families across Texas and California in the 1920s and 30s built entire meals around two ingredients that cost almost nothing and kept a family fed for days: dried beans simmered slow, tortillas made fresh from masa ground by hand. Today, a restaurant sells refried bean tacos for $12 and calls it street food. The families who actually lived on it called it Tuesday, number 39. Migastale tortillas, torn into pieces and fried crisp with eggs, onion, and whatever chile was on hand, turned yesterday's leftovers into a hot breakfast that tasted intentional rather than desperate. Tejano Ranch households across South Texas built this dish specifically to keep tortillas from ever going stale enough to throw away. Nothing sat in that kitchen long enough to spoil before someone found a use for it. Number 38. Menudo beef tripe, simmered for hours in a broth heavy with chile and hominy until the tough tissue finally turned tender, was Sunday morning across Mexican-American households throughout the Southwest. Tripe was cheap because most people wouldn't touch it. That made it exactly the cut a family stretching every dollar could actually afford. And generations later, it's still the dish families gather around, not despite where it came from, but because of it. Number 37. Bread and milk-torn bread, a bowl. Milk poured over it until the bread softened. Nothing else. Rural poor families nationwide leaned on this when the pantry had emptied down to its last two items, and it filled a stomach for pennies. There was no seasoning to disguise what this was. There was only a mother making sure her children went to bed with something warm inside them. Number 36. Cracker soup crushed saltines, dropped into a bowl of hot milk until they went soft, and the whole thing thickened into something close to porridge. Rural families nationwide turned to this on the nights when even a proper soup wasn't possible, when the pantry held nothing but a box of crackers and a bottle of milk that needed to stretch across more mouths than it was ever meant for. Number 35. Poor man's soup of potato, an onion, water, and whatever fat was available simmered together until the potato broke down and thickened the broth on its own. Nationwide, in both rural farmhouses and crowded city apartments, this two-ingredient soup fed families for days at a cost that barely registered on a grocery bill. It asked nothing of a kitchen except patience, and it gave back exactly what a hungry family needed. Number 34. Cabbage soup cabbage stayed cheap and available through every season, in every region, in a way almost no other vegetable could match, and Eastern European immigrant families, along with rural poor households nationwide, leaned on it hard through the Depression. Simmered low for hours in water, with whatever scrap of meat or bone was around, it stretched into a pot that fed a family for 2 or 3 nights, running off a single head of cabbage that cost next to nothing. Number 33. Split pea soupa ham bone, saved after every holiday meal instead of thrown away, went back into the pot with dried split peas and simmered for hours until the marrow and the last scraps of meat worked their way into the broth. Farm households nationwide understood that a single ham bone had more to give than the first meal it was served at. It could feed a family a second time, and sometimes a third, if a cook knew how to ask. Number 19. Corn pone no flour, no eggs, no milk. Just cornmeal, water, salt, and bacon grease, shaped by hand into small ovals and fried or baked until the crust went dark and the inside stayed dense and warm. Appalachian and Deep South families made this when even the ingredients for hoe cake, back at item 90, weren't fully in the house. This is the floor beneath the floor. The version of cornbread you made when you had almost nothing left to make cornbread with and still refused to go without bread entirely. Number 18. Souse meat sandwich. We already met souse back at item 98, but this deserves its own moment. The same hog's head meat, cooled and jellied, sliced thin and laid between 2 pieces of bread for a working man's lunch pail. It carried through a whole day of labor without spoiling, without refrigeration, without a single wasted part of the animal that gave it. The whole hog, twice over, refusing to let anything go to waste. Number 17. Government surplus peanut butter real New Deal commodity programs distributed peanut butter alongside other surplus goods to struggling families through the late 1930s and into the 40s, a shelf-stable source of protein and fat that didn't need refrigeration and didn't spoil quickly. Families spread it on bread, stirred it into oatmeal, ate it straight off a spoon when nothing else was available. This was a government finally putting real calories into hungry hands, decades before anyone thought to call food assistance a policy instead of charity. Number 16. Hardship hash whatever was left at the end of the week. Potato ends, the last of a vegetable, a scrap of meat too small to serve on its own, chopped fine and fried together in one skillet until it browned and crisped at the edges. Nationwide, this was the meal that had no fixed recipe because it was never meant to have one. It was built fresh each time out of exactly what remained, and it proved once more that nothing in these kitchens was ever truly left over. It was simply waiting for its turn. Number 9. Pot liquor and cornbread the pot was never empty. Collard greens had cooked down in it for 2 hours with a piece of fatback and a handful of black pepper, and what remained in the bottom was not broth. It was something darker than that, silkier, the color of strong tea left too long on the stove. Grandma ladled it into a bowl, crumbled yesterday's cornbread on top, and set it in front of you without explanation. In the rural South and the Appalachian coal fields of the 1930s, pot liquor was considered the poorest meal a family could serve. Nutritionists at Tuskegee University documented it differently. Every vitamin the greens gave up during cooking ended up in that liquid. Iron, calcium, folate. A bowl of pot liquor with cornbread delivered more nutrition per penny than almost anything else on a Depression-era table. Grandma just called it not wasting good food. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 8. Milk gravy over cat head biscuits rolled big, the size of a cat's head, which is exactly where the name came from, so that one biscuit, split and covered in gravy, could fill a grown man's plate on its own. Appalachian and Deep South families made the gravy from flour, milk, and whatever fat was in the pan thickened until it coated the biscuit instead of pooling around it. This wasn't a small breakfast. It was built specifically to be enough for a family that couldn't afford a second helping. Number 7. Beans, fatback, and cornbread, the holy trinity of the entire decade. Eaten more nights than any other combination on this whole list. Across the Deep South in kitchen after kitchen, that never once compared notes with each other and arrived at the exact same 3 ingredients anyway. Beans for protein, fatback for calories and flavor, cornbread for the starch that filled in every gap the other 2 left behind. Together, they weren't a compromise. They were a complete meal discovered independently by an entire region of women who understood nutrition without ever calling it that. Number 6. Cornmeal mush with molasses breakfast, lunch and dinner in the leanest weeks. Cornmeal boiled soft in water, sweetened with a spoonful of molasses because sugar cost more than a family could spare. Appalachian and rural Midwest households leaned on this when even beans weren't reliably in the house, and a bowl of it, eaten 3 times over, kept a family standing through a week that offered almost nothing else. This is not a meal anyone remembers fondly for its taste. They remember it because it kept them alive. Number 5. Egg in a whole one egg, cracked into a hole, torn from the center of a slice of bread, fried together in a hot skillet until the yolk set soft in the middle. Working-class families nationwide stretched a single egg into what looked and felt like a fuller breakfast than it actually was, the bread doing the work the egg alone couldn't do. A child ate it and believed there was more on that plate than there really was, and that belief mattered as much as the calories did. Number 4. Sunday company chicken once a month, if that. A family in the rural South or Midwest killed a chicken specifically for Sunday dinner, and every single soul in that house understood exactly how rare that made the meal. This was not a regular occurrence dressed up as special. This was genuine scarcity, and genuine celebration built directly on top of it. A family who ate beans and cornbread 5 nights out of 6 understood the value of that chicken in a way modern abundance has made almost impossible to feel again. Number 3. Hobo Stew Railroad camps during the worst years of the Depression ran on a simple, unspoken rule. Whatever a man had, he threw into the communal pot, and whatever came out belonged to everyone standing around that fire. A potato here, a can of something there, a scrap of meat one man had managed to find that day. Strangers, most of them, riding the rails with nothing else in common, fed each other off a shared pot because the alternative was every man eating alone and going hungry more often than not. That cooperation wasn't sentimental. It was the only math that worked. Number 2. Bread and gravy, no meat, not even fatback in the pan, just flour, water, or milk if there was any, and whatever fat could be scraped together poured hot over stale bread. This is the absolute floor of what a family in the poorest households nationwide would serve when 1933 had taken everything else away. There is no dignity twist to soften this one. There is only a mother, a skillet, and a decision that her family would eat something warm tonight, no matter how little that something actually was. Number 1. Grandma's Sunday beans. Every family on this list had one dish that was theirs specifically, the one nobody else's mother made quite the same way. For some it was beans simmered all day with a ham hock until the kitchen smelled like nothing else in the world. For others it was a pot of something entirely different, passed down with its own name, its own small adjustments nobody outside the family would have known to make. Universal across every region this list has touched. The South, the plains, the coal fields, the tenements, and entirely singular in every single kitchen it came from. This is not one recipe. This is the idea underneath every recipe on this list. A woman, a pot, and a family she refused to let go hungry, no matter what the decade demanded of her. Closing pot liquor and cornbread. Chicken fried steak. Grandma's Sunday beans, whatever she called them in your own family. Taste them again. Cook them again. Say their names out loud again to someone who might not remember them much longer. These women were not poor cooks making do with poor food. They were the most resourceful nutritionists, chemists, and preservationists this country ever produced, and they never once asked for the title. They earned it in kitchens with dirt floors, in tenements with no icebox, in coal towns where a single egg had to feed more than one mouth, and they did it with a competence that 100 years of food marketing has spent every single day since trying to make you forget. The food industry did not modernize these recipes. It buried them, then dug them back up decades later and sold them to you as someone else's invention, at a price your grandmother would never have paid and never would have charged. That is not progress. That is theft with better branding. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made.